He never confessed. Not on the first night, not after weeks of questioning, not in the 10 years that followed. Most wrongful convictions from post-war Japan run on a confession, squeezed out of an exhausted man in a small room. This one had nothing to squeeze. A 25-year-old in a northern castle town said he had not done it, and he kept saying it while the state took a decade of his life. What convicted him instead was a white shirt, a pair of canvas shoes, and a number: 98.5%. Japan's most celebrated forensic scientist had calculated it in Tokyo. The judges believed it. 25 years later, the very same court that convicted him would rule that not a single piece of evidence proved his guilt. This is the story of how a number did the work that evidence was supposed to do.
Aomori Prefecture sits at the northern tip of Honshu, where winter arrives early and buries everything. Hirosaki is its castle town, a place of temples, apple orchards, and a medical university that gave the city its small share of prestige. In the summer of 1949, Japan was 4 years out of the war and still under Allied occupation. Food was short, housing was short, and the country was operating under a brand new Code of Criminal Procedure, imported and rewritten under American supervision, in force for barely a year. On paper, it promised the presumption of innocence and a fair trial. Nobody yet knew what that would mean in a provincial courtroom. On the night of August 6th, in the Zaifu-cho district, someone entered the home of a Hirosaki Medical University professor. His wife, 30 years old, was stabbed once in the neck. The wound was fatal. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Nothing of value was taken. The weapon was thought to be a blade ground down from a metal file, a homemade knife, crude and personal. The original investigation never recovered it. A professor's household, a quiet street, no motive anyone could name. The city wanted an answer quickly, and the police understood that.
16 days later, they arrested Nasu Takashi. He was 25, unemployed, and lived about 200 meters from the professor's house. He denied the killing on the first day of questioning, and he never stopped. When the murder case stalled, officers re-arrested him on an unrelated charge involving an ornamental pistol, held him, and then re-arrested him for murder again. He was indicted that October. So what did the prosecution actually have? A white shirt and a pair of white canvas shoes said to belong to him, said to carry the victim's blood. A police dog said to have tracked toward his home, and traces of B-type blood found nearby. That was the case, and almost every piece of it came apart the moment anyone looked closely. A local examiner reported human blood on the items after a procedure that took about 2 hours, using a reaction that was understood to need roughly a full day to develop. Weeks later, the National Police Science Institute in Tokyo examined the same material and reached a far weaker conclusion. The type was B, but human origin could not be confirmed, and there was a real risk of a false positive. One officer acknowledged that he had wiped the shoes with saliva. And then there was the shirt. When it was first examined in late August, the marks on it were described as a dull grayish-brown. When it was examined again in October, they were red-brown. Nobody ever explained how stains change color in a police evidence locker. None of this stopped the case. It simply moved to a higher authority. Furuhata Tanemoto was the most famous forensic scientist in Japan. a professor at Tokyo University, a recipient of the Order of Culture, the country's highest civilian honor in the arts and sciences. His textbook on forensic medicine had gone through more than 20 printings. He examined the shirt, and he produced a figure. The probability that the stains came from the victim, he concluded, was 98.5%. To a courtroom in 1949, that number sounded like the future itself, science reducing doubt to a decimal. In reality, it was built on two things that would not survive the next 2 decades. The first was the blood typing system it relied on. Alongside the familiar A, B, and O groups, the calculation used categories developed in Japan in the mid-1930s, known as the Q and E systems. They were never accepted internationally. They were later shown not to exist at all, and they quietly disappeared from forensic textbooks around 1965. The second problem was the arithmetic itself. To reach his figure, the calculation began by assuming a 50-50 chance that the accused was guilty before weighing the physical evidence. No justification for that starting point was ever given. In other words, the number that helped convict a man began by assuming he was as likely guilty as not, and then handed the court a decimal that sounded like proof. There was one more expert voice. A psychiatrist examined the accused for a total of roughly 15 minutes and reported a congenital neurosis with sadistic tendencies, then went further than any examiner is asked to go and volunteered that this man was certainly the true culprit. A re-examination 2 years later by a Tohoku University psychiatrist found no such tendencies at all. In January 1951, the district court in Hirosaki acquitted him of murder. He was convicted only of the firearms offense and fined 5,000 yen. Prosecutors appealed. In May 1952, the Sendai High Court reversed that acquittal and sentenced him to 15 years. The evidentiary record had barely changed. What changed was who was reading it. Among the testimony the appellate court accepted was the victim's own husband, describing how the young man's breathing rate rose under questioning, from around 20 breaths per minute to nearly 30, as though nervousness were proof of murder. In February 1953, the Supreme Court dismissed the final appeal. The conviction was closed. He served 4,378 days. Akita prison first, then Miyagi. Parole requires remorse, and remorse requires admitting the crime, so when the parole board came, he refused 6 separate times. He was released in January 1963 at 39, having given up years of freedom rather than say the words. 8 more years passed, and then, in the late spring of 1971, inside Miyagi prison, the same prison where he had been held, another inmate told a cellmate that he was the one who had killed the professor's wife. The account traveled outward, to the released cellmate, to the defense lawyers, and then to a Yomiuri Shimbun reporter who had been chasing the case for years. On June 30th, it became public. The man repeated it to newspapers and on television. He also described the house, the width of a hallway, the location of a well, details investigators had never published. Here is the part that reveals the whole system. By 1971, the statute of limitations had already run out. Whatever he said, he could not be prosecuted for it. And he was never charged, never tried, and never convicted of that killing by any court. The first retrial petition was rejected in December 1974. The court accepted that the confession was highly credible and still refused because the standard of the day demanded new evidence practically certain to overturn a verdict.
Then, in May 1975, the Supreme Court issued the Shiratori decision. Reasonable doubt, it held, applies to retrials as well. New evidence no longer had to be conclusive, it only had to raise a genuine doubt. The door opened. A retrial was granted in July 1976, and on February 15, 1977, the Sendai High Court, the same court that had convicted him 25 years earlier, declared that not a single piece of evidence proved his guilt. On the shirt, the judges were blunt. There was reason to doubt the stains, and they could not serve as evidence at all. Prosecutors let the deadline pass without appealing. It was the first retrial acquittal in a murder case under Japan's post-war code.
Line up the three verdicts and something uncomfortable appears. Acquitted in 1951, convicted in 1952, acquitted again in 1977. Across all three, the physical evidence was essentially the same pile of material. What moved was not the facts. What moved was how much authority a courtroom was willing to grant to a confident expert, and how much doubt it was willing to tolerate. That is the first thing this case teaches, and it is why it still gets taught. The conviction did not rest on what the evidence showed. It rested on who was saying it. A decimal from Tokyo University did the work that proof was supposed to do, and a 15-minute psychiatric opinion supplied a motive the investigation could not. Strip the reputations away, and there was never a case, which is precisely what the 1977 judgment found, in language that stopped just short of saying the stains had been manufactured. Commentators have been less restrained. The court's own reasoning, no marks noted when the shirt was seized, an unexplained change in color, and irregular pattern, points somewhere very specific. The second thing is the arithmetic of what he got back. Compensation came to just under 14 million yen for 4,378 days in custody, roughly 3,200 yen a day for a decade of a man's life. He then sued the state. He won partially in 1981 in the first post-war ruling to find prosecutorial negligence in a wrongful conviction. That win was reversed entirely in 1986, and the Supreme Court closed the matter in 1990. Prosecutors, it held, are shielded unless they act in bad faith. He ended with nothing beyond the original compensation, and no apology was ever offered by the police, the prosecutors, or the courts. And the third thing is that this was not one bad night in one provincial courtroom. The same expert's blood typing testimony appears in 3 further convictions later overturned at retrial: Saitagawa, Matsuyama, Shimada. All 3 were death sentences. Some have argued that a single overconfident science quietly shaped a generation of Japanese criminal justice. Looking at that list, it is hard to call the argument unreasonable. Nasu Takashi died in January 2008 at 84. He had asked that his death not be made an occasion. He spent 10 years in prison for a killing he did not commit, then spent 13 more in court trying to make the state admit it, and lost. He was cleared, and he still lost. Both of those are true, and the second one rarely makes it into the story. What stays with me is the shape of the thing. Every safeguard in that new post-war code was technically working. There was a trial, there was an appeal, there were experts and a Supreme Court and written judgments, and all of it produced the wrong answer for 28 years because one number sounded too authoritative to question. The man who came forward could never be tried. The man who was convicted could never be repaid. So, what do you think? Was this a single scientist's error, carried too far by courts that wanted certainty? Or the system doing exactly what it was built to do, protecting itself all the way to the end?